We'll be listening to a tape of Maharishi speaking about brain and consciousness. I've recorded the closed captions on PowerPoint, so we'll be able to actually see what he's saying very clearly. And then we'll go through and we'll just unpack it. John is kind enough to be here with us virtually, and we'll discuss back and forth. We'll have a discussion. You know, what is Maharishi saying? Because this is the big question in today. What's the relationship between a field, which is outside of time, outside of space, which has no dimensions, with the brain, which is just in time, in space, has dimensions? So this is what we'll be doing. There'll be multiple time for questions. We list the tapes about 10 minutes. I'll talk a bit about what brain functioning is. John will be adding his comments, and there should be lots of time for back and forth.
The reality of the path is that consciousness is produced by activity of the brain. The reality of the goal is that the brain is born of consciousness. It's very big. The brain is born of consciousness. So that, and then it said knowledge is what makes life material or spiritual. Sap for the tree. Experience of pure spirituality enlivens all phases of living. And then it continues. Every state of consciousness has a physiological parallel. Knowledge of spirituality dwells in the physiology of the brain. This is a very remarkable main point. Number 6. Knowledge of spirituality dwells in the physiology of the brain. Huh? And brain is material, consciousness non-material. Surprisingly, consciousness is materialized by the non-material activity of the material brain. Natural integration of brain and consciousness structures life. The period there. Natural integration of the brain and consciousness structures life. This integration is at the basis of life. Life is integrated wholeness. It's a very good sequential inferences, very beautifully. Supremely refined brain activity projects wholeness of awareness, wholeness of life, fullness of the spiritual value. It's a very, very balanced language. This thing is very good, huh? That knowledge of spirituality dwells in the physiology of the brain.
Point number 7 is a little paradox. Perhaps one could say consciousness is actualized by the non-material activity of the material brain.
What it says, brain is material, consciousness non-material. Surprisingly, consciousness is materialized by the non-material activity of the material brain. We can take off surprisingly. It's spicy. It creates some. Yeah. Very good. Something.
Then it uses the material.
No. Yes, material brain produces activity, which is non-material. And because this activity produced by the material is non-material, that is why that non-material consciousness could become a living reality, or could be actualized.
Is the non-material activity a reflection of the non-material by the brain? That's the activity which is non-material?
Material brain gets transformed into a non-material substance, and which is its own activity.
Is this a way of...
This is the way of transference of material into non-material. The activity in itself is non-material. Now the material brain appears as its own activity, which is non-material, and this activity has the value of consciousness. It's so beautiful. It's so remarkable. There is that relationship, and yet completely uninvolved.
Is this like lesson 8 of Science of Creative Intelligence, the physiological correlate of it?
Something to that, in that direction. Something. Because in this, no? How the material brain and non-material consciousness can have a relationship. The material brain can appear in a non-material value in its own activity. The activity of the material brain is in its nature non-material. It's
I don't understand how the activity is non-material.
activity is non-material. Activity in itself is non-material.
All activity generically is non-material.
All activity. The brain is material, but the activity in it.
But it's material activity. Material.
Yes, is the material, but activity in its structure, in its status, in its nature, in its character, is certainly non-material.
It's like energy, which is different.
Energy, yes. It's very interesting. And here is the seat of consciousness in the non-material. So the seat of consciousness is not in the material brain. It is in the activity of the brain. And activity of the brain as such is non-material.
Is it the activity that reflects pure consciousness?
It's the activity, it's specific activity, specific quality of activity or specific value of activity is responsible for specific value of consciousness. Dream, sleep, consciousness, pure, cosmic, or specific activity.
Did you say, Natahu, that there's
So the seat of consciousness is not in the brain, it is in its activity. It is in the activity, it's in the metabolic rate.
the seat of consciousness is localized at a particular point in space?
Seat of consciousness is localized for the individual,
Where the brain is active?
where the brain is.
Or should deep sleep would still be some sort of activity?
Oh,
Producing that.
yeah. That's what that says. Supremely, where is that? Supremely refined brain activity projects wholeness of awareness. Supremely refined brain activity. When that kind of activity comes, then something that is omnipresent starts to be reflected in its full value. And that is unbounded awareness. Omnipresent being starts to be reflected in its full value. And that is unbounded awareness. It's just the reflection, that kind of activity. And when different kind of activity, then the same omnipresent being reflects in different quality. And that is sleep consciousness, dream consciousness, anger, worry, anything. But it's the same thing, reflection of the same. Reflection of like the reflection of the sun on muddy water, clean water, waving water, settled water. That is the glory of relationship of brain and consciousness. Here we see the actual mechanics of how the material brain can produce non-material consciousness. The material brain has to appear in a state of non-material value, and that is activity. And that activity then reflects that particular consciousness. So if the seat of consciousness is not in the brain, but in the functioning of the brain. Because when the brain stops functioning, that's the end of consciousness. The brain remains there, but the functioning stops. So when the activity ceases, then there is no seat of consciousness. So seat of consciousness is activity.
It's in the non-material activity of the material brain. So let's unpack this. When Maharishi says seat of consciousness, he's using the word consciousness. What is he indicating? What is that label for? Just speak out and what does he mean there?
The primary connecting point? The poem.
Yeah, let's be simple. It's being, it's pure consciousness. It's that field of consciousness. Where is the seat of that? And it's so incredible. In one sentence, Maharishi is answering it. It's in the non-material activity of the material brain. And he was talking with MIU's faculty here. And they were trying to wrestle, well, how is activity non-material? Isn't it the material working? Maharishi said, yes. Do you remember the point? He says, but it's the function, it's the nature of that activity. And the nature of that activity is changing states. There's no continual static structure, but the material, the brain, is taking a changing state and then it disappears. Let's look, I'd just like to follow this idea and let's look at what is the activity of the brain and how can a field, which is outside of time and space, it's non-localized, can somehow have a seat in this activity. So that's where we're going. John will be making comments and then we can open it up. So let's look at the brain. So here's the brain. Weighs about 2 or 3 pounds. It has a central line here which separates the left and right side. Left side has more short-range connections, other side has long-range connections. This is actually, it's looking at you. So this is the forehead here. The brain doesn't have a crystalline structure. It's not like a rock or a piece of metal. It's more many neurons that are embedded together and they're separated by spaces. So let's look at the different components of brain activity. And this is important because one component of brain activity is digital processing. They're called action potentials. And what that is going down the connection fiber. It's called an axon. Charged particles, ions, move in and out. And when it gets to the very end, chemicals are put into the space. It's called the synapse, and it grows to the other side. And then there's some further activity. This takes 1,000th of a second, a millisecond. It's very, very fast. There's not much consciousness here. What it's doing is the cell that it's talking to, it's simply moving that cell a little bit closer to firing, a little bit further away. That's what these action potentials are doing. There's 1,000th of a second. Each cell is getting inputs from 1,000 other cells. There's this huge dynamic activation going on. So there's not much space to see where a field of consciousness could have its seat here. But there's another layer of brain functioning, analog processing. Digital is a specific burst, a 0-1. Analog is continual changes. These are called slow graded potentials. This is what we're measuring in EEG. Continuous change over time. These are in the time frame of 1/10 of a second. And what these are is they're summing. What is the result of thousands of inputs, thousands of action potentials? And the cell is moving either further away from firing or closer to firing. Now, again, I don't see much opportunity for a seat of consciousness here. But the third component is our quantum processes, and specifically we'll look at on the level of the synapse. Because what is happening is, I talked about the action potential coming down the axon. It doesn't always go to the other side. It doesn't always affect the next neuron. It's not a classical switch. It's not 0, 1. There's a probability. Because it's a probability, I think this is where the field of consciousness can influence the physiology. So there's trillions of these. There's a 40 to 60% chance the action potential can move. And so if we have the seat of consciousness is in the non-material activity, it's the flow of interaction across all of the different brain areas. Do we see this empirically? Yes. Well, first, here's the synapse. This line here is the actual synapse. The top thing is the output fiber. This is the axonal bulb. This is called the dendritic spine. It's like a little sprout that grows out. This is a whole dendrite. This is a very tiny space, and it's just a space. It's not a structure. It's not a box. It's a simple space between the output fiber, the axon, and the receiving fiber. Now, is this indeed a probability? Eccles says yes. Superposition of all of the vesicles which carry the neurotransmitters which allow the signal to go through, they're superimposed in superposition of firing and not firing. And what happens when one fires and then the other are stopped? Another reason why this may be quantum processes is at the level of the synapse, we're out of the classical world and the classical laws, and we're in the level of the quantum. And so they're probabilities, they're not points of matter. For the process of the signal to go, a calcium ion has to enter the output fiber here. That's what this is showing. And then the calcium ion brings the vesicle to the center, and then it goes into the space. Calcium ion, again, it's a wave, it's a probability, it's not a point. The calcium channel is very, very narrow, so that wave going in may not find a bag of chemicals called vesicles, bag of neurotransmitters, to bring to the end of the axon to actually allow this to happen. So these are neuroscientists recognizing the uniqueness of these synapses. So this is my suggestion. Perhaps the field of consciousness modulates the flow of brain activity through the synapses, creating different patterns of brain functioning. So empirically, what do we see? So imagine you have on earphones and you're getting sounds to both ears. You're asked to attend to, it's called shadowing, speak out. What are the sounds in one ear? And this is how the brain is responding. So attend to left ear is a solid line, attend to right ear is the dotted line. So the left ear tones, when you're told to attend to those tones, notice the brain is processing it more deeply. And why is it doing it? You're just sitting there. Information's going into both ears. You're getting pummeled by this auditory stimuli. But you're attending to the flow of consciousness is to one ear or the other. So this in neuroscience is thought to be the power of attention, but we can also see this may be the power of how the field of consciousness is modulating the flow over the brain to bring out some specific type of experience. And then you're told to attend to the right ear tones. And when you attend to the right ear tones, you notice how the brain processes the right ear tones is different. This idea of consciousness not being localized into a point was brought out in this article from Scientific American, and it's called the connectome. Perception, thinking, emotions, decisions, feelings are not a specific part in the brain, but it's actually a distributed firing over the whole brain. So what you're seeing here is this is done with neural imaging. And so the colors are the areas of the brain that were active, and these are during the different types of tasks, different areas, somatic control, salience, and so on. And what you see is the whole brain is involved in every task. It's just a different level of flow through the brain structure. So something dear to our heart, transcending. What is the flow of the brain that supports the experience of pure consciousness, of being, the transcendent? Well, what we see here are two colors. The blue colors are coming from a system in the thalamus called the core nuclei. The yellow are from a system called the matrix nuclei. The core nuclei are bringing in sensory information. The light coming from the power point goes into the eye. It goes into the center of the brain here called the thalamus. It goes to the specific part of the brain that processes vision. So the blue circle and this information coming through the thalamus is what allows us to see the world. The others, the yellow lines, is awareness, wakefulness, coming up the spinal cord. What this does is the thalamus is sending information to the specific part of the cortex is sending information back. But what the yellow input here is modulating wakefulness, awareness itself. So what's happening when we transcend? When we start the mantra, thoughts are becoming more secondary. The inner experience of unboundedness is becoming more primary. And when that is happening, what is supporting it are these wakefulness circuits. The wakefulness circuits, which are always there, they're there now, but they're covered up by all the thoughts and feelings and so on. So the experience of the transcendent, which has no content, is not supported by zero brain activity, but is supported by a very specific pattern of brain functioning. It's a pattern of brain functioning which is non-specific, which is general. Now there's a lot of information here. It takes 50 milliseconds to go from the thalamus to the cortex and back. 50 milliseconds to go to the cortex, 50 milliseconds to go back. So that means every 1/10 of a second this goes up and down once. So if you take a signal which is once in 1/10 of a second, it's going to go up 10 times in a second. And that's what we see during our TM. What we see here is x-axis is time. Each column is a second. Each line is a different point on the scalp. Notice how the signals are very similar across all the points on the scalp. You don't need to have seen EEG to just recognize whatever is happening seems to be the same on all points of the scalp. Also, let's count it. How fast is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is this 10 cycle per second wave. This is just these thalamocortical loops which are maintaining wakefulness. It's that style of brain functioning which is allowing that quality of consciousness, of experience. So that's some points I wanted to bring out. To turn it over to John, and then we'll have an open question period.
So first of all, this is a great topic and stunning quotes from Maharishi. I don't know what year. Do you know what year this was from roughly?
1974.
Yeah. Maharishi has said things that go way, way back that are incredibly prescient, including when he wrote The Science of Being and Art of Living and projected that scientists, physicists would one day start talking about a unified field, et cetera, et cetera. This is another example of that. Very interestingly, we're living in an age of AI explosion. And in this AI explosion, we are still using predominantly digital computer technology, which does not have, it has a tremendous amount of sophistication, but it doesn't really have the subtlety that Fred was just talking about when he started to talk about quantum processes in the brain. In fact, as I've mentioned before, digital computers are designed to be absolutely immune to any subtle fluctuations because they have to be absolutely reliable in their digital predictions, which means zero mistakes. However, Billions, many billions of dollars are being spent right now in refining quantum computers. And in some ways, that will inevitably, and before long, take over certain types of processing that require extreme delicacy or extraordinary speed. Isn't the word. Speed is part of it, but today's digital computers have plenty of speed. It is I'd say a type of comprehension and the ability to sweep and simultaneously entertain thousands of physically contradictory, logically contradictory options all at once, so that you can somehow find calculational paths within these ocean of possibilities that's showing promise without having to do each path one at a time. So quantum computers, their bits are not called bits, they're called qubits or quantum bits. They may be something as simple as, oh, this isn't exactly how they do it today, but in principle similar. You take an electron, which is a particle with spin, and all particles have spin except for the Higgs boson. Nobody likes the Higgs boson. Makes us all fat. Um, so you can take a particle like the electron, and these particles with spin are always spinning. The electron has two spin options. It's either spinning up or down, which is a shorthand for saying they're spinning clockwise like this, where your thumb is pointing up if you mimic the spin with your fingers, or counterclockwise like this, in which case we call that spin down because the thumb is just the reminder of that convention. But quantum particles are not spinning up or down. If you measure the spin of a particle, you will find it either up or down. And that's part of the limiting nature of measurement. Classical measurement can only, what's the word, register up or down. There's no possible piece of equipment that can register up and down. So when it comes to classical measurements and what we consider machinery and coarse matter, that's not quantum. It's at the level of the quantum bit or bits, where every single electron has a coexistence of options. It could be 99% up, 1% down, 98% up, 2% down, 97% up, 3% down, all the way down. And there are probably over 100 different combinations that today's quantum computers can discern between. If you try to pack maybe thousands of spin angles into an electron, the equipment is not yet sensitive or stable enough to try and accurately determine which level. But today's quantum computers, maybe you have 100 different possible simultaneous and classically incompatible possibilities for the spin of the electron, which classically is either up or down. In any case, that level is now being intensively explored with money by people like Musk and many others, billions of dollars, to try to get the edge on this new type of reality, which is quantum reality. The sophistication of the machines, the care with which they have to be handled, they have to be kept at the 1 degree above absolute zero. You have to completely shield against any outside disturbances whatsoever that could muddle or tip the accuracy of any one of those bits in the machine. And there may be today hundreds of bits, approaching thousands of bits, and soon more and more. But it only takes a handful of bits, to solve problems that simply couldn't be solved in one lifetime using high-speed digital computers. Because not for all kinds of problems, but for subtle problems, quantum computers have a huge edge because they deal in the world of not actuality, but pure potentiality. And they can add potentialities together and multiply them together and get potentialities of potentialities in a way that you just can't do on a yes-no classical level. So the brain that Fred was describing, it's a marvel. I mean, the brain is a marvel. How long did it take to evolve a brain like that? Well, literally billions of years, with some catastrophic failures in between the beginning of life and today. You know, the dinosaurs, I guess, got boring for the creator and eventually wiped them out. But fortunately, there were at that time a few mice and similar creatures that were small mammals that were able to survive the catastrophe. And that mammalian brain was a huge head start when the next generation of organisms started to populate the Earth. And we were already a significant way towards human life by then. But the nature of the brain, even a mouse brain, and a mouse brain is probably not horribly different from a human brain, but obviously the sophistication and complexity is much more sophisticated in a human brain. But nevertheless, we have been, our evolution has not been driven by who can bite hardest and which dinosaur is bigger than the next. It's been driven by intelligence, the intelligence of the human race, not our physical strength, not our fabulous wool coats. We have some of us have very little coat at all. It's on the basis of intelligence and ingenuity that we survived, and hence the evolutionary force on the brain was to come up with something that was better, more sophisticated, and as Maharishi describes, incredibly subtle in its sophistication to make us conscious. Now, human brains are probably not the only ones that are conscious in the sense that a mouse or a cat, and you play around with them, are obviously conscious, but they're not conscious of consciousness. And that is something that humans can gain, although it's not a snap of the fingers. It does take a precious, delicate technique or techniques that Maharishi's revived, and it takes years of practice to really, start to stabilize and gain quick and easy and clear and unbounded access to that level of mind where, where it's being tapped for its full potential. So what I would say is this, to summarize. This sentence, you had a better one. Here's the one I happen to scribble down. The material brain has to appear in a state of non-material value. And that activity then reflects consciousness. So the brain has to slip into a mode where it is functioning on a non-material level. And quite honestly, I could not come up with a better description of what that quantum mechanical realm is. Now, physicists are familiar with deep quantum mechanics and quantum field theory when it comes to elementary particle collisions. But it's pretty crude stuff, and we're just trying to create a particle and try to catch it before it disappears. Quantum computers are not working with enormous particle accelerators at astronomically high collision energies. Instead, they're working with the subtlest implementations of quantum mechanics of extreme purity and extreme silence and no external bombardment which could muddy those beautiful, clear quantum waters. So if our brain, and it is quantum mechanical, everything's quantum mechanical ultimately. It's just a question of, do you need quantum mechanics to really explain the basics of how you digest milk? And the answer is probably not. Ordinary chemistry does a pretty good job without taking recourse to quantum mechanics, which is a much more difficult calculation and something we avoid wherever we can. But in the brain, to function in a way which is a junction point between what we call physical reality and the non-physical, non-local world of the quantum. And that, is exactly the processes that we were hearing about from Fred a moment ago are just that. They are very delicately set up processes to remove classical confusion out of the picture and let the pure probabilities of quantum mechanics carry the signal forward, where it's a non-material process because, an electron cannot be in multiple spin states at once, but quantum particles can, and quantum chemicals can, but they have to be isolated. And in that gap, which is nothing but space, Fred says, between these two aspects of the neuron, is a perfect place for this non-material quantum evolution to take place. So Marcia, just one more thing, gave talks, and I've been sharing some of those talks recently on that level, that very fine film that connects the brain and body to consciousness. And he calls that level of experience the resolute intellect, which is beyond what we normally think of as intellect, because intellect is discriminatory, and the first discrimination the intellect makes before it does anything else is it distinguishes the knower from the known in the process of knowing. Then you've got an arena in which to play. But if you haven't even discriminated the knower from the known, if there's nothing but unity in that pure abstract state of silent awareness, then there's no thinking going on. But on the verge of transcending, when the intellect is the pure intellect, the resolute intellect, at the very basis of what we call mind, the foundation of mind, when those legs of this knower knowing and process of knowing, Rishi, Devata, and Chandas get pulled in, and yet the intellect is still, in a sense, abstractly aware, not in the sense of drawing distinctions, because you need Rishi, Deva, and Chandas for that, but just where it's still aware and sinking into the field of pure absolute abstraction, sinking inward into pure being. That he describes as the junction point between pure absolute and relative. And there's probably nothing local about that absolute reality. The relative reality, our human bodies and brains are, quite localized. But that junction point is a very, very subtle area. And Maharishi, again, has described it in so many ways, and it's always rather abstract, but the resolute intellect, or Nyaya, lamp at the door, which he translates as resolute intellect, where if you have a light at that doorway to the absolute, that light can shine outward into the world of intellect and mind and can shine inward to illuminate the transcendent. And it's really just at that junction point as the mind gets fully collected to resolute intellect and then just dissolves into pure being. That's where you experience transcending. Because when you're actually deeply transcended, there's nothing that could be characterized as experience in any normal sense, because there's no knower, no known, no process of knowing. At least that's the story in TC and also even in CC. So that junction point, I think, is the point where what we call physical reality goes into this world of, at best, mind, or world of ideas. Quantum mechanics is non-material. Quantum mechanics is not material. It's wholly on the level of concept. It's wholly on the level of mind. So it's that junction point between absolute being and matter that I think Marshy's talking about here, when the brain is actually at that refined state of settled self-awareness, with the specifics dissolve or are dissolving and have dissolved, is then just pure abstract awareness. But when it comes to mind and mental computations and fulfilling a desire and accomplishing an aspiration, even then, you have to think on a subtle level, unless you're just maybe playing tennis, I don't know, but you have to think on a very refined level. And that, I think, is where the quieted brain, particularly the transcending brain, is really, the environment is quieted down to all the mechanisms the body has to silence the chaos. And maybe Fred can talk about what some of those are someday. Leaving what? Leaving this most settled state of awareness, which is uncluttered by the sort of complications that would prevent quantum processes from happening. So I've talked a little too long, but I'm basically, Fred has me thinking about, and continue to think about with him and others, this quality of brain where this is happening, the mechanisms by which happening. It's certainly set up to do exactly what Fred has described. Exactly how we might describe that from a quantum mechanics language and so forth, we can work together on that. But I think he's captured a very key point when it comes to this junction point of non-material and material, and that the brain provides that fertile field in which that junction point can exist, and it's been set up in a way to actually allow this junction point to function, just as a quantum computer, but a lot cheaper and more fun. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That's great. So what questions have been bubbling up?
So on the chart that you had with the digital, analog, and quantum, if I understood correctly, you were saying that on the quantum field that there's a 40 to 60% chance of making contact. Does transcending more often, transcending consistently, allow that percentage to go up? And would there be an advantage to increasing that percentage?
What transcending is a specific pattern of brain functioning that allows a specific quality of consciousness to be experienced. And that's the key point. The brain functioning is allowing a specificity to come out from a field which is pure generality. You have something which is whole. What is going to determine how a specific value of that is expressed? And it seems to be expressed relative to the non-material activity of the brain, whether you're practicing GM and transcending. Because when we experience the transcendent, what it is the experience of the unboundedness being experienced from the level of our physiology. It's being experienced based on our brain functioning. It's our own private experience. And then when we come out of meditation and we start walking around the world and we begin to bring that value into activity, what it is now is the pattern of functioning, the non-material functioning of the brain is now allowing a different quality of consciousness to be expressed. That is wholeness and point at the same time. In the waking state or in sleeping and so on. So that's the way I understand it. Should we go back and forth? Anyone from this side? In the back? Okay, Peter, you have to run.
Could we possibly go back to the slide where Maharishi talks about the water, and he talks about different waters? So he says, reflection of the same, reflection of the sun on muddy water, green water, wavy water, settled water. That is the glory of the relationship of brain and consciousness.
The water is used as an analogy here.
Yes.
And the analogy is that something is the same in everything. So the point it's bringing out, omnipresent being reflects in different qualities. So there is something which is infinite. There is something which is the same in everything. The degree to which it's reflected is dependent in this model by the qualitative activity of the brain. So if it's a mouse brain, you're not going to get human consciousness, you get mouse consciousness.
Maybe mouse consciousness.
In terms of the sun, it is. In terms of its expressions, it's a subset. Let's take a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old and a 15-year-old. How they see the world is fundamentally different. They're the same value of consciousness being reflected in them, but owing to different qualities of the nervous system, how that consciousness is being reflected is different. And what this is bringing out is what we need to do is just to refine the physiology, our sleep, our exercise, our diet, how respectful we are of our meditations, our relationship with others. All of those are continually refining the physiology so that we can experience more and more of the field of consciousness. So let's talk more afterwards. Yes, over here. Yes.
Hi, Fred. So thank you very much, and thanks, John, for this interesting enigma that you've presented to us. The question I have is sort of taking it one step further. I understand that the activity, there's the activity of being, which drives the activity of the brain, which then creates a non-material activity that is appreciated as consciousness. And so my question is sort of what drives that activity? If we understand from what, so let me just explain what I think is being said, and you can correct me or extend it if you want. So I understand that in a sense, omnipresent being is driving the activity. That's the control center, you might say, as constrained by the nervous system and the activity that it's capable of reflecting. But the purpose inherent in that activity must be to some way, in some degree, just evolution, basically, right? So it's the being trying to express itself more fully over time that drives the activity of the brain, that reflects the activity of that being. Is that essentially the case? So the desires that are springing forth, are those desires reflected in the desire of being to fully express and reflect its full potential? Is that kind of what's going on?
It could be. Way I see it is the natural tendency of life is to grow. And that's just fundamental. And so we have, starting with the field, singular, whole consciousness, awake to itself. And as you know, the whole sequence, because it's a field of consciousness, it can be aware of itself. Now suddenly this field of wholeness is taking the value of knower, is taking a specific value. For this, it requires activity, energy. And so when the knower value comes out in this fundamental field, at the same time, the energy, the dynamism comes out. In terms of Sanskrit, it's Rishi and Devata. And what these are doing is they're covering up what was there before. And what was there before was wholeness, singularity. And this covering aspect is Maharishi defines as the chandas. So what you have in this fundamental field is two things. It's a superposition of singularity and the relationship, the balanced relationship of these three, Rishi, Devata, and Chandas. They're coexistent at the same time. And Maharishi said there's an infinite frequency between those. And that infinite frequency is transformations of wholeness into wholeness as a knower, and so on. And that dynamism is where all of life comes out. So this is the picture we're given. Now, why are we evolving? Why are we growing? Is anything actually happening? You know, at some point in our evolution, we realize nothing has really happened. It's just there's wholeness. Wholeness is fluctuating within itself. Something has risen. Now something has come back to silence. In another level of our evolution, we might have a different awareness. We're asleep. Nothing exists. I don't exist. The world doesn't exist. All these are different levels of possible experiences within that wholeness. But in terms of where we are now, I see that it's just that. The natural tendency of life is to grow. That's why we came to the talk. I think I can get some deeper understanding.
That's
why we do our
generic.
program.
That's
and
what
so
all
on.
of us, in a sense, are doing at all times. But
Yep.
each of us is different.
Yep.
In a different point in that. And that must be part of the driving impulse for the activity that goes on in our individual nervous systems.
I would also say, if you can hear me, I'm not sure, but
Yes, we can hear him. Tell them you
I
can hear
wouldn't,
him.
We I can hear you, wouldn't, John. I wouldn't say it's transcendental consciousness or the pure abstract absolute being that is driving our day-to-day activity. It's transcendental. Now the story changes in different states of consciousness. You usually have to pick one. But in cosmic consciousness and waking consciousness, it's our thought processes and it's our karmas and it's our needs and it's the bodily requirements and so on and so forth that kind of keep us going. But the nature, which is ingrained in every living being, probably, it seems, as Maharishi would describe it, to grow, to become more knowledgeable, more powerful, more expanded, more blissful, and ultimately enlightened. Although most people don't know what that means, it's still driving them in the sense that everybody wants more. I would call, the force of evolution the driver, but that evolution occurs in the relative, realizing oneself and I am eternal, immortal, I've never changed. I am, that is, it's coming back to what we are, and it's allowing through our nervous system that absolute to enjoy that reality. Whereas without the physical body, or maybe some divine bodies, that experiencing aspect that requires mind and senses, and actually ego, intellect, mind, senses to exist, wouldn't be there. And I suppose that's a motivation for creation. I am one, let me be many. So it's a small point I think I'm making, and that is I don't think we should consider the absolute the driver, a driving force of our lives. I think what happens when cosmic consciousness and higher states dawn, you've reestablished a connection between the ignorant relative self and the absolute abstract eternal being. And at that point, our minds are so attuned and close to that field of being that our actions are aligned with that evolutionary force of life. And still, though, it's our mind that's driving, but it's all in tune with natural law and with being. So I don't know if that was a particular point of interest of yours, but I thought I would make that comment.
Thank you, John.
Dr. Travis and Dr. Hagelin,
Yes.
we have several questions online.
Okay. Choose
Would
one.
it be all right if we
Yes.
go for some of them? So from Thomas, regarding the Maharishi lecture, he was inquiring whether the content of the lecture potentially provides a solution to the hard problem of consciousness.
Yes.
And,
It's
from
and
Dr.
just to expand that, what's the hard problem of consciousness? Something that Chalmers came up with is some problems about consciousness are easy to address: perception, thinking, anything which is computational. The hard problem of consciousness is, why are we experiencing what's going on? And indeed, neuroscience has been stopped since the early 1990s. They haven't made any forward progress. 1990s, they came up with neural imaging. You can actually see what is the area of the brain that's active while you're seeing, hearing, deciding, touching, thinking, transcending. And they said we should be able to locate neural correlates of consciousness, and they haven't been able to. And from what Maharishi is saying, it's because there isn't a specific correlate. It's not in the pineal gland. It's not in the frontal lobes. It's not in brainstem. It's in the non-material functioning, staking the overall brain together. So it addresses and answers that problem.
And from Dr. Margaret Strickland, how is spontaneous right action possible? What determines our decision-making on a neuronal level?
First, all greetings to Dr. Strutman. What determines our decisions on a neuronal level? Well, as she'll tell you, if you sit with her, there's two phases of processing any information coming in that we come up with a decision. It's called the low road and high road. The low road is fast. It takes less than 1/10 of a second. You get an immediate emotional response. And that rises, and it sets as if the context for the second phase, which is the actual computation of what is there. And that usually takes 1/3 of a second to 400 milliseconds. And what that does, it comes and it gets embedded in the immediate emotional response. So you walk into a room and you instantly get a feeling. Maybe if there's any business people here, you go into a business meeting, immediately you know if you're going to make the deal or not. There's this low road response, and then you take in all the decisions and you put them together. And that's always affecting our decisions. And if we're stressed, if we're tired, if we're fatigued, the low road response is seeing problems, it's seeing divisions, is not very flexible. What we're doing as we transcend, we're transforming the low road response. Now the low road response is terms of that experience of the transcendent. I'm whole, I'm full, I'm complete. There's nowhere I want to go. There's nothing else I want to be. And what that does is then when you're in a situation, the immediate emotional response is not in terms of something limited, something partial. It's in terms of the fact that the natural tendency of life is to grow. You give that person the opportunity. And so you see them in a different way. They're not colored by your past experience. I think this is why spontaneous right action comes up. You're in the situation, you're not being dictated by things that happened in the past. It's what is the need of the time. You've probably heard that term. What is the need of the time? And so you respond to the person as they needed to be responded to. So I think that's how spontaneous right action happens. Dr. Hagelin, would you like to expand on that? Spontaneous right action from Dr. Margot Sutman.
When you have, in cosmic consciousness, and that's where spontaneous right action begins, stabilized, you are not really aware of what's taking place between the absolute abstraction of your inner silent witness and your outer acts of speech and action and your mental processes. That's part of God consciousness, to fill in the mechanics of those finer and finer levels of thought, levels of perception, touching on the field of being and melting into unity consciousness, where the entire continuum of life, from absolute to relative, is one, undivided wholeness. However, in cosmic consciousness, Maharishi says stresses are gone. They've been removed from the system. Stresses, you could still have, a sty in your eye, and you could have something that we kind of maybe consider a little bit stressful. But for Maharishi, stress means that which is limiting our awareness from unboundedness, that is stuck and is resulting in our ignorance or lack of full understanding of the nature of life. So you can still have, okay, near vision or something like that when in enlightenment. And that's not what Maharishi defines as stress. Stress is that which obstructs the experience of total knowledge, pure being. But in any case, when all that stress is cleared out, yes, you may not be aware of how a thought emerges and bubbles up out of the absolute as a very faint idea. You may only become aware of it when it kind of pops on a conscious thinking level. But that thought has come from pure absolute of your untarnished being. And there are no sanskaras or stresses or unfulfilled desires or frustrations or fears along the way as that thought bubbles up and takes on greater and greater concreteness as it goes through the machinery of the thinking process and finally emerges on the surface of the mind is, I want a double cheese pizza. Now, it may be that in waking consciousness, you're having that desire for a double cheese pizza for the wrong reasons because you had such an overwhelmingly a gluttonous but fulfilling experience last week. You want to have it this week. Those distortions of thought from being purely evolutionary are gone in cosmic consciousness. So your thoughts as they appear on the surface of life are fully life-supporting and life-nourishing. So that's spontaneous right action. It's action that, like all thoughts initially, emerge from natural law as a desire for more happiness, more knowledge. And even in cosmic consciousness, it's your desire on behalf of your environment and your loved ones and the world as a whole that is motivating those thoughts more than your own needs. But in any case, the thoughts are evolutionary and they're undistorted, unpolluted on the way to the service of life. So there's no stress to distort or pervert your thoughts, and there is no absence of total knowledge at the foundation of being from where the thoughts emerge. That's how I would explain that thoughts could become spontaneously in harmony with natural law.
Thank you, John.
Dr. Travis, in your opinion, what kind of relationship between consciousness and the brain is necessary in order to explain the phenomenon of near-death experiences?
It's a very good point. What it brings out, this is actually, we have a whole lesson on this in physiology, is consciousness. Near-death experiences is self-awareness Well, first, the body completely shuts down. EEG is flat, heart is not beating. So the non-material activity of the physical brain seems to be stopped. Why are there stable experiences over time? And that's because the way I understand it is we'll use the analogy of the sun, and the sun reflects off of different reflectors. The sun is pure consciousness. The different reflectors is the non-material activity of physical structure. But there are specific rays that link the sun with the object. Sun's 360 degrees all around, but there's specific rays that reflect off of the specific object. So in this, and in Sanskrit, it's called jiva. Jiva is individual universality. Isn't that a great term? Individual universality. It's like telling someone the color of the chair is black-white. But it's universal in that it is the sun, it is pure consciousness, it is wholeness. It's individual because it's our connection with that. Indeed, once the body drops off, as Maharishi said, consciousness stops the functioning. That means that person will no longer talk and it won't see the world. But something continues. And what is continuing, I think, is what people are experiencing. This is who I am when my body is not here. And this is who I am that's connected with the Creator. Dr. Hagelin.
Yeah, that's a very good part. I would add maybe this. I gave a talk on this in India yesterday morning via Zoom to a physics and spirituality conference. And I talked specifically about, I started with Maharishi's tape, Subtle Bodies and Rebirth, where he talks about the gross physiology, subtle physiology, and very subtle level of our individuality called a causal body, which Maharishi describes as the cause of the birth of the physical body and the birth of the subtle body, which embodies at the subtler levels our mind, even our senses, our intellect, etc., the inner person. That subtle body, while we're here on this earth, is quite tightly wed to the physical body, and the physical body comes to dominate our sensory experience, and the physical body has great usage. It can do things the subtle body can't, and the subtle body can do something the physical body can't. And that also has to do with what it's made of. And physics these days is focused on subtler levels of matter, including good candidates for what the subtle body, if it exists, might be made of. Now, I really think that Fred was smart to mention that these experiences of an out of physical body experience in which you are experiencing, you're seeing, you're witnessing, is real. There's no question about that. I had an experience after a motorcycle accident, which was strikingly real and, absolutely, startlingly real. And it was an amazing thing to be there. And anyway, that's a different story. So these are real. I mean, I think we can judge from the literature and we can judge sometimes from our own experiences. So that body is a subtler aspect of the physical body, which Maharishi talks about in that absolutely lovely tape. And it carries on the process of growth and evolution for a while. And then it is time to be reborn if you're not yet enlightened. And Maharishi goes into a great deal about the mechanics of how and why that happens. So, and I don't really remember what triggered the question, but maybe that sheds a little bit of additional light on the question.
Thank you, Dr. Hagelin.
Yeah, that was great. The person was asking about near-death experiences. It was very appropriate.
Dr. Travis, I was wondering if you could maybe comment about this concept of a bit of consciousness that is in Dr. Nader's paper about consciousness is all there is. And it seems like a bit of consciousness could be the sun pulling the moon. I mean, or, the Andromeda galaxy sees the Milky Way, or whatever, or Jane sees the flower. And but when I see your presentation about the brain, it seems like we're getting in a wholly different level of reality.
Excellent. A bit of consciousness. It's quite a brilliant concept that Dr. Nader has presented, because what it does, it expands consciousness beyond inanimate objects to inanimate objects. And it's bringing out that anything which is real, there's some object there, there's some knower, and they're being connected. And when those three are together, Dr. Nader says that's real. For instance, when we left today, there was a bar of chocolate on the table. And when you were sitting there looking at the chocolate bar was real. And now you can think about the chocolate bar, and the thought of the chocolate bar would be a bit of consciousness. It would be real, but someone might have came and eaten it. It may not be there. Dr. Nader's bringing out, it's okay. It's because it's real for you. And he's bringing out that all of our experiences are real for us because we're the experiencer. We're having some experience. And what you said so greatly about the galaxies, it's true about trees and the birds. There's some interaction they're having. So it's these three coming together that creates reality. And even to the very basis of life, where consciousness is aware of itself. That's real because those three values are there. Now, what's interesting is psychology has a similar idea. It's called reflexive consciousness. That consciousness isn't in here. It's not a neural correlate, but rather it's the relationship of you with the object. How your attention goes out, you see and interact with the object. And those three coming together is what is consciousness. It's the reality of those three together. Dr. Hagelin, would you like to respond in a bit of consciousness? Okay.
No, I think you had it just right. The idea that this three-in-one structure of knower, knowing, and known doesn't just pop out late in the universe when hominids, humanoids, and chimps appear on planet Earth. But, even from the very beginning, you could say that there was matter. And although, very different from what it looks like today, but nevertheless, there were interacting particles. And that's all part of being. Those are all made of being, made of the unified field. And those interactions with themselves or interactions with each other are something. There's, physics that comes out of that. There are consequences of that. So all of that is not nothing. All of that must fit into the three-in-one structure of reality as it's described by Maharishi in the Vedic wisdom. So one of those you could say is playing the role of knower, one of the known, one the process of knowing. You could probably flip those roles. But so even at that rudimentary level, you have unity and you have trinity. And that 1 to 3 to 8 to 24 to 64 to 192, that structure of emergence of multiplicity from the primordial structure of Veda as knower interacting with the known through the process of knowing, that's the same sequential unfoldment that we see from string theory today. It's the exact same sequence of numerical unfoldment of unity into duality, into multiplicity. So just as physicists, Rajaram recognizes those early periods in our universe as real and somehow must come out of pure consciousness, out of pure Veda, out of pure being. And if it's made of being, which is really a knower, a known and process of knowing, then you can, in some rudimentary sense, you should be able to find Rishi, Devata, and Chandas in even the most elementary particles and interactions. So that's the point he was making in his book, because the focus of his book was to make it clear that ultimately it's all consciousness. Consciousness is all there is. And if he's going to say that, well, then he has to show how electrons have consciousness and are made of consciousness. So I think it works.
Good afternoon. Thank you to both of you and all of us for being here. So I'm trying to concretize this in my head. So when I look at the chocolate bar at everybody's, I make a better decision. It sounds like this activity, this infinite dynamism in the synaptic gap, this energy is born from the physiology and then must return to the physiology. And I'm seeking to make an analogy of the sun, the cloth, and the dye, and the sun being that infinite energy, the cloth being the physiology, and then that dyeing process being the reabsorption from the synaptic gap. So I'd appreciate some research assistance from both of you in that theory.
Thank you. I think we have some mixed metaphors here. So the cloth and the dye is talking about a whole different process. That's how, so we take dye, we take a white cloth, we put it in the dye, it comes out yellow, puts it in the sun, most goes away, some remains, puts it in the dye, and so on. This is to give a sense, a concrete metaphor for how allowing the mind to go to the transcendent, and then what that does, it creates a whole pattern of brain functioning, and then coming out, and what the brain does is it starts to put those together. Because it's the nature of the brain to change. It's not a concrete structure. It's not a static structure. It's built to change. And what it's doing is taking each experience you have, and then it's trying to change the connections as if changing the weights of the flow through the brain. So next time you're in that situation, you'll do better. And this is what's driving the color being put into the cloth. And so that analogy is just how the transcendent can become more part of our daily life. The point about the field of consciousness, so there is quality of activity through the brain, but what is modulating it? You put your attention to your left ear or your right ear. What's modulating it is you. Because who are we? We're not a man. We're not a woman. We're not an age. We're not a nationality. We're not a religion. Who we are that fundamental field of pure consciousness. That's who we are. And we're activating this physiology to see the world in a specific way, to allow more of who we are to actually be expressed. And so that's how I see it. With every intention we have a specific experience. What that's doing, it's modulating the brain circuit. So next time, the brain is just an interface. Next time when we're in the world, this interface will give us a little bit different picture.
If you could please address the apparent dilemma of the mutual dependence on consciousness and the physical brain. They seem to be depending on each other, are the expression of consciousness and the physical brain having that non-material activity. If there's that apparent mutual dependence, seems to bring up a limitation, which we don't want.
Very good. So what the dependence is a field. The sun is just always there, but I want to be active in Florida in this time and so on. That's what the brain is for. What the brain physiology is doing, and that was one of the, at the very last point here, where she says, once the brain stops functioning, now there's no seat for consciousness. There's no seat for the field of being to actually be expressed in an individual experience, an individual person. So yes, and it's an interesting point that how does the brain get developed? Well, it's from consciousness itself, creating patterns within consciousness. These become patterns of natural law, and they become fine particles, and they become the world around us. So that's the picture we have, that from a field of consciousness, matter, full field of physics comes out. But then, having created their creation, the creator entered into it. At each point, as a physical structure is being created, some value of that value of self-referral consciousness can be expressed in time and space. And so on that level, yes, brain functioning is very important because it's determining what's the quality of consciousness being expressed. And for us, that's how higher states emerge.
So what is the handle to get the whole thing?
We don't need to get it because we are the sun. And what we're doing is we're being able to express ourselves in time and space. And what we want to do is just want to continue to refine the functioning of the physiology. That means we have to take care of ourselves. We have to exercise. We have to sleep. We have to eat good food. We have to have a respectful meditation practice, nourishing relationships, because what these are doing, they're allowing the physiology to change, and now fuller values of pure consciousness can be expressed. Consciousness is just waiting to have full unbounded awareness inside and outside. And so what we're doing with everything, your action to come here, when you leave here, the world's going to look different to you. And what's happened? There's been some talk, but you've internalized it, you've thought about it, you've changed connections, and they're affecting how you're seeing the world. John, did you get the question?
I did. It's a very good question. And what's in it for the sun? Well, the sun is the sun is consciousness. But it's consciousness if it's in between creations, for example, in which case, there's nothing but being in its quiescent phase. And then, there's that natural desire. Maharishi says, I am one, let me be many. The capability of that intelligence we call the heterotic string theory, or we call universal being. The sophistication of it is such, it's like having a Lamborghini in the garage. It's made to, a Jaguar is made to run, a Cheetah's made to run. So it has a resting period, and then from that, through processes that are somewhat understood, there's a big bang that emerges from that. But in any case, the sun is the source of light. Pure being is the source of consciousness. And it shines through the nervous systems in the universe is really the channel through which it really shines most clearly upon its objects of creation. Human nervous system in its capability for high states of enlightenment. And cosmic consciousness is enough, Maharishi said, for the angels in heaven to breathe. Meaning, when cosmic consciousness is there in a human being like any of us, suddenly the absolute can see the relative through our senses, through our mind and thoughts, and really has an active role in the universe. Before that, it's just rather disconnected from its universe. And so there's an urgency, Maharishi says, always to have enlightened people. But really in higher states of consciousness where the totality of Brahm as knower, knowing, and process of knowing, the reality of the universe is being not even just the unbelievably vast universe in which we live, but really fathomed most deeply is a simultaneous coexistence of every imaginable universe. Every logically possible universe exists right now in the absolute. And in unity consciousness and in Brahman consciousness, we are living all of that in the nature of oneself. You can bring your attention to any of that you want to draw it to, but just so without the human nervous system, and there may be divine nervous systems, and there may be physical nervous systems on multiple planets who've long achieved this, the absolute has a chance to really celebrate and enjoy itself that in a way that it cannot do without organisms such as us. So there's a lot to be gained for both consciousness, universal consciousness, and us who are the chariots of that consciousness, the carriers of that consciousness. So I see a lot of potential bliss in that.
Thank you. The slide, Fred, with the quantum, you don't need, well, you could bring it up, with the quantum connections at 40 to 60%.
Yeah.
It may sound like a humorous question, but it's serious. Does that mean that otherwise I'm only making connections 40 to 60% of the time? I'm not finishing thoughts and flow? And also, how does all this relate to brain disorders like dementia?
Very good. The point is, let's by analogy, there's 1,000 roads to Rome. And what we see is maybe one of those is no longer being very profitable. So now it branches off. And so that's the idea of 40 to 60%. Different pathways are being supported, other pathways are being cut down. It's not as though you're not seeing the world, you're not having continuous thought, but how do you think about your thoughts? What's your level of metacognitive ability, empathy? All of those things depends upon the total flow. So it's on that way, but the key point for me is, I got really excited when I saw this because it makes a realistic bridge between a field and the physiology. And it allows us, for me as an EEG scientist, I can say when I see that flow of information across the brain, the reason it's that way is because the brain is leading to a specific state of consciousness. You're asleep. You're in the transcendent. You're in CC. And what we are doing is we're actually modulating that flow for a specific outcome. Do I want to meditate now? Okay, so this is what I'll do. And specific channels are being supported so that thought activity becomes less, wakefulness circuits become more, and you maintain that experience. So it's more like pruning or focusing the actual outcome rather than stopping it. Thank you, Paul. This has been great. Thank you, Dr. Hagelin. Thank you for connecting.